I'm Jeremy Scahill from Dropsite News, dropsitenews.com. It is Tuesday, June 9th. Well, at least 36 times we've been in the situation that we're in right now, just over the past few weeks. And that is that Donald Trump claims that a deal with Iran, that he claims is going to be a great deal, is imminent, and that it just takes a little bit more maneuvering. And he always tempers that by saying that he can resume massive bombing. At times, he said that he's going to destroy all of Iran's civilization if it doesn't come to the table. And then he also simultaneously says that Iran is begging to make a deal. The past few days have brought an intense flurry of activity. The Iranians had warned for many, many weeks. In fact, since the initial ceasefire was signed that led to a round of diplomatic talks in Islamabad back in early April, the Iranians have said that one of their red lines, one of the conditions for any deal, is that a ceasefire must apply to all of the theaters of war in the region. And they really have been zeroing in an intense way on Lebanon, where, of course, the Israeli occupation forces have waged a scorched earth bombing campaign in southern Lebanon. Hezbollah has fought back quite tenaciously against the Israelis, but Israeli forces did manage to move north of the Litani River. And part of what seems to be Netanyahu's thinking here is that if Trump does make an agreement with Iran, and if he respects to whatever extent the Iranian demand that the ceasefire apply to Lebanon, Netanyahu wants the position of the Israeli occupation forces when the music stops at that period to be as deep into Lebanon as they could make it. You know, Israel now has created this fictitious concept of the yellow line. They're doing this in Gaza, where despite a ceasefire, they've killed nearly 1,000 Palestinians since the October deal went into effect. But the Iranians had warned that if the Israelis continued with their attacks against southern Lebanon, and in fact, if they began to attack Beirut, that Iran was not going to sit idly by. And so late on Sunday night, Iran launched a barrage of ballistic missiles at Israel, conducting a number of strikes. We don't yet know the full scope of what the Iranians hit, but what we do know is that in the past, Israel has downplayed the types of targets that the Iranians hit. And as the dust settled and we learn more, it's quite clear that Iran has sophisticated intelligence and an ability to actually strike at military and intelligence facilities inside of Israel. The Israelis then responded, conducted a number of airstrikes against Israel. Donald Trump claimed that he had warned Netanyahu. This pattern also played out, not just with Trump, but with Biden, where we hear that the US president is growing very, very upset with Benjamin Netanyahu, only to then return to the reality that the US and Israel have acted in concert, hand in glove, ever since October 7th and the onset and launch of the intense Israeli genocide. And in fact, right now, as we're speaking, the Israeli forces in southern Lebanon, in Deir Saur, are continuing to conduct very, very heavy strikes. The Iranian military, in a statement yesterday, indicated that it wasn't just attacking Beirut that would be considered an actionable event that Iran would need to respond to, but they also suggested that continuing these operations in southern Lebanon would also constitute a violation. There is certainly intense diplomatic activity. Pakistani leaders, regional players from Qatar, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, to one degree or another, are all very, very involved. And we have a great guest that we're going to bring on to talk about this in a moment. But first, I want to welcome my Dropsite colleague, Ryan Grim. Ryan, there's a lot to get to. We have a really packed show, but it does seem like we're once again in this position where Trump is telling people early in a week, watching the financial markets, forcing the New York Knicks to lose, that war could be again resuming, or Trump claims there could be some kind of a deal.
Yes, and just real quickly, because I do want to get to Mohammed. Trump did indeed cost the Knicks Game 3. It's not clear, what that will do to his psychology and in what ways he will lash out, particularly for the extent of the booing that he got from the public at the stadium. A couple points of context here. The entire kind of financial markets have been propped up over the last several months on a record run, the last 2 months since the quote unquote ceasefire. by particularly Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, and assessing that the Strait of Hormuz would be open by June. We're now in June. Trump is pushing hard up against their analysis. And if their analysis falls apart, part of the structure of this kind of fantastic market that we've had starts to crumble. Meanwhile, the World Cup starts in the United States in just days. And Trump has the 250th birthday celebration of the United States, not just centered around the 4th of July, but the festivities that he has planned in Washington begin in the weeks leading up to that. He's got a fight. He's got this entire spectacle that he has been planning. And I don't think that when he launched this war in February, he thought that it would be ruining his celebration. So all of those things combined, looming financial crash, plus the celebration that Trump has been planning, I think put a new crunch on his effort here.
Yeah, no question. Well, I do want to bring on our guest, Mohammad Ali Shabani. He is joining us from the UK. He's an award-winning Middle East expert and scholar, also the editor of Amwaj.Media, which is a London-based news site focusing on Iran, Iraq, and the Arabian Peninsula countries. I also want to just say I've become an avid reader of Amwaj.Media. It is a phenomenal news site. And I was talking to Mohammed earlier about this. I think what both Amwaj and Dropsite are trying to do is swim against the stream of short attention span theater that the public has become accustomed to. And I really encourage people to check out Amwaj.Media, and Mohammed, also the great journalist Ali Hashem from Al Jazeera, is a regular contributor and journalist at Amwaj. But Mohammed, thank you both for your work and for joining us this morning on Dropsite.
Thank you so much for having me, and congratulations yourself on excellent output on Dropsite. I really appreciate everything you guys do. You really are at the top, even on Iran. Kind of a competitor sometimes, but you guys are doing really great. So congratulations.
Yeah, I don't, I mean, I hear you. I don't even see it as competitive. I mean, I read your work, and I think it's informed me so much. And I more consider you guys kindred spirits than competitors.
And also, let me make one point about the layout of your site is so cool. Like it's innovative in the way that you'll have these like in-depth, detailed pieces, but then also pull elements of them out for people who don't have a whole lot of time, in a way that combines, like, the way that Axios will just give you that little tiny bit, and if you want more, forget it. Whereas you guys do both. So I'm an admirer just from a production standpoint.
All right, love fest over.
Thank you so much.
So, Mohammed, you and I both, and you're journalists also, we talk to Iranian officials, which is something that not many English language news organizations do. And we have sources within Hezbollah, within Hamas, within the Iranian government. And I just wanted to share the latest commentary or analysis that I received from one of my Iranian government sources. And this was just as the Iranians were launching their retaliatory strikes against Israel at the very end of this weekend, saying that the Israelis repeatedly crossed a red line and that time was up. And this is a direct quote. "The primary person responsible for the current situation is Donald Trump himself. For nearly 20 days, the draft of a potential agreement has been on his desk, yet he has continued to postpone it with various excuses, driven by his fear of the Israeli lobby and his hope that the naval blockade plan will prove effective. We in Iran will no longer accept or tolerate his current position. Due to his impaired judgment and decision-making, he's no longer respected by any of the warring parties or the mediators. At this point, reaching an agreement is not really feasible, as our proposed provisions for the country's reconstruction have not been accepted." He added, "Should Israel carry out another attack on Beirut in the coming days, missiles will immediately target areas within the occupied territories in retaliation." Now, Mohammed, as I understand it, and I'm curious to hear what you're hearing, there's two basic issues. There's a number of small issues, but there's two central issues that have emerged right now. On the one hand, it's this situation in Lebanon and Israel's scorched earth bombing. On the other hand, the Iranians are saying, we will not enter into an initial memorandum of understanding, an MOU. This, by the way, is not the nuclear negotiations. This is just about ending the war, dealing with the Strait of Hormuz. We aren't going to enter into anything unless there is a repatriation, or as they say in the Western media, an unfreezing of a substantial portion of billions of dollars in Iranian assets. Mohammed, give us your sense of where things stand right now and what you're hearing from sources.
So I think it's quite complex right now, the state of the negotiations. I think it's more complicated than just Trump sitting on a draft for the past 20 days. I think on occasion, Iran itself has been sitting on drafts and has been loath to kind of offer a clear response. And I think part of this reason is because they don't want to trigger it. I think neither side wants to come with a hard no out in public, at least. And I think this is part of the bargaining process. I think each side thinks that time is in their favor. And this is a very important, I think, part of these negotiations. And so we've seen this process kind of drag out. We have the ceasefire on April 8th. There was this expectation initially that, they would resolve things in the next couple of weeks. That didn't happen. We're in June now. Trump, I think now for the 30th something time, has come out and said we're going to have a deal in the next 2 to 3 days. So what's on the table right now, I think mainly concerns what you point out about Lebanon, which is scope. From the outset of this truce, there was dispute between Iran and the US about what it actually entails. Iran was quite adamant that it entails ceasefire not just between Iran and the US, but also respective allies. And I think almost immediately Israel went out, tried to challenge that. And the Trump administration sided with Israel on that. And then things got really awkward because Pakistan, this third-party intermediary, this mediator, went out and essentially sided with Iran. And it gets even more complex because nothing is really written. We don't have an official document out there, right? Kind of solid point of reference, which all of us as journalists can just look at and say, okay, what does it actually say in there? That's one major problem. And I think they're trying to resolve that with this MOU, with this memorandum of understanding that there are a set of guidelines. So that's number one. There's a push and pull we're seeing right now about whether to contain this deal to Iran, the US, or whether to get Lebanon involved. And I think Israel and Trump less so have a strong interest in decoupling Iran from Lebanon for one basic reason. That even if there is an Iran-US nuclear deal, Israel wants to make sure that the so-called regional threats are also addressed, right? And I think here after October 7, what we've seen from Israel, not just with reference to Iran, not just with the axis of resistance, this kind of regional alliance network, which consists of Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas, a bunch of Iraqi groups, etc. Essentially, Israel has changed this perception of threat. In political science, a threat, it usually consists of two components. One is capability, the other is intent, right? So Israel right now is just looking at capability alone as a threat. And this changes everything, because it means anybody in the region that has any capability, even if they don't have the intent, even if they have capability to do anything, any kind of harm to Israel, that's a threat. And this is part of the reason why we're seeing Israel shift its discourse towards Turkey, for instance, right, the past couple of months and weeks. So I think this is a key component of what we're seeing on the table right now. It's about the scope of negotiation. The second element is the sequencing, right? So sequencing is about what comes first, what comes last. So there's a kind of push and pull about who's going to take the first steps, who's willing to show the most flexibility at the outset. And keep in mind, the confidence and trust level right now is sub-zero. And the reason it's sub-zero is because Iran has been attacked not just once, but twice in the middle of negotiations over the span of a single year. This is unheard of. Trump administration has set out a reputation for itself. And not strangely, all the intermediaries involved in this process are aware of that, right? So Iran is not being seen as kind of this irrational actor that, oh my God, they're paranoid for no reason. There's a reason for their paranoia. So Trump, it put itself in this position. And now it's struggling with this kind of dilemma of, okay, how much are we going to, again, going back to sequencing, how much are we going to front load in this process? How many so-called confidence building measures are we willing, by we, I mean United States, willing to put on the table? And the third element to all of this, making things even more complex, is Trump for years has made a kind of, it's almost like a tagline, going out, bashing Obama for handing over, quote, pallets of cash, which is Iran's own money as part of a 2016 prisoner swap. And he doesn't want to be perceived as doing anything remotely looking like that. And Israel's allies in Washington are very cognizant of that. They know that's his Achilles heel, and they're going to push on it. They have been pressing on it in public. So here he is kind of boxed in by not just his own actions over the past year, having bombed Iran twice in the middle of negotiations, but also his own legacy of attacking Baba and not wanting to be seen as weak or kind of hypocritical. And then again, fold it into this bigger picture. How does this sequencing look like? How does the scope look like? And I think these are fundamental and substantive issues that they've been trying to resolve over the past couple of months. I'm not sure how much they've come to a resolution. I think they are close. The mere fact that we're sitting here and we're talking about sequencing, I think that matters a lot, because it means in principle they accepted that something like this has to happen, right? To have a deal. The only question is, when is it going to happen? But when you come to the question of when can sometimes also be as important as the actual what if, right? So this is the kind of the state of things that I see it based on the people I've spoken with. And it's not just Iranian officials, it's also regional intermediaries.
You mentioned that Iran believes that it kind of has time on their side, compare at least relative to the United States. Can you talk a little bit about what your understanding is of the economic situation on the ground in Iran, how that flows into the domestic political situation? Because here in Washington, you've got a lot of pro-Israel voices as a last gasp saying, well, if we just hold on indefinitely, perhaps something will snap in Iran. So don't reach a deal because things are tenuous there. What's your understanding of the situation on the ground economically and politically?
So there are a number of important things that have changed since the February 28th, when this war was launched on Iran. The number one thing is that the domestic power dynamic has completely shifted. The reformist president, Masoud Pezeshkian, was almost an accidental president, right? He was elected in a poll that was only held because the previous president was killed in a mysterious helicopter crash, right? So he came out of nowhere. Pezeshkian was an MP, he was a member of parliament. And in this kind of race that he had versus the hardliners, he won by a small margin. And now he was installed as president, and then war happens, right? So his authority from the outset was not very strong. And he tried to resolve that dilemma of what do I do if my political base is not very strong? What do I do? I hide myself behind the supreme leader. What do I mean by that? I mean that Pezeshkian from day one of his presidency has expressed almost excessive fealty to the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the person who was killed on February 28th, whose son currently is the supreme leader of Iran. And he did this by essentially on day one of his, for instance, confirming his cabinet, going to the parliament and saying, I didn't just submit the traditional kind of four ministers who need the approval of Khamenei, which is the ministers of Interior, Defense, Intelligence, and Foreign Affairs. I submitted my entire cabinet to Khamenei to be pre-approved and pre-reviewed. This is unheard of in Iran, right? And by hiding himself behind Khamenei, he made it impossible for the conservative-controlled parliament to kind of reject this cabinet. So it was entirely approved immediately. This was a smart short-term political strategy to get his government approved. But then the issue arises of that fundamentally what you do when you embark on a route like that is that you undermine the presidency as an institution. So this pattern has been ongoing. This preceded the war. When the war began and you had Ayatollah Ali Khamenei killed, you had senior military commanders who you can refer to them as pragmatic. People like Mohammad Bagheri, these people were all killed. And this new generation kind of take over. The current IRGC chief commander, for instance, Ahmad Vahidi, a person who served as interior minister under former President Raisi, someone who's known for having, without blinking, led a very harsh and deadly crackdown on unrest. This guy he's tough. He's from a different breed. He's in charge now. People like him are in charge now. And the president's authority with Ali Khamenei out of the picture has eroded completely. He deals now mainly with domestic matters. So power right now is concentrated in the hands of the IRGC, both current and former commanders. One of these former commanders is the parliament speaker, Mohammad Barak Ghalibaf, who's also a conservative. So I'm just explaining all of this to kind of give you a sense of the domestic political landscape, that you had a weakish president already try to prop himself up by hiding himself behind Ali Khamenei, the former supreme leader. Ali Khamenei out of the picture, outright war. Of course, we essentially now have a military-led administration in Iran. That's the political side of things. And this matters because the military guys, they're less concerned with economic matters. We've seen Pezeshkian go out in public and, quite explicitly say that this is a disaster what we have right now. And he's not wrong. The inflation rate, including for foodstuff in Iran, is skyrocketing. It's almost 200%. People are being crushed. And it's not just that you have inflation because there's been disruptions to commercial shipping and things of that nature. Keep in mind that 90% of Iran's imports and exports used to be carried out through the Strait of Hormuz. So it's not just other countries that are impacted by the kind of blockade of the Hormuz, not just by Iran, but also by US forces. There's also Iran itself, right? But in addition to all of that, you had a more than 2 months long internet shutdown that was just kind of ended recently. And you have millions of people in Iran who rely on the internet to make a living. I'm talking about more than 1 million people just using Instagram to sell stuff, right? So you have all these people whose livelihoods have been impacted. You have skyrocketing prices. There's no kind of light at the end of this tunnel. So this stuff shouldn't be downplayed. The domestic economic political situation is dire. Having said that, the people who are in charge are not really concerned about that. They are confident that they can crack down hard on any kind of unrest that may erupt. And we know this because the person who currently commands the IRGC himself directly oversaw protests or the crushing of protests under Raisi. That's number one. Number two, they're not going to offer these massive concessions. They're not ready to do it, the military guys. So this is the bigger picture. You have a dire economic situation. You have a shifting political landscape. Is Iran hurting economically? Absolutely. There's no dispute about this. However, the key question for Washington is it hurting enough to cry uncle? As the things seem right now, unlikely. And we have specific examples of this. We had the FDD go out, one of their guys saying, well, hold on a second, we have this naval blockade. In 2 weeks, Iran's oil storage is going to fill up. They're not going to be able to do anything. They're going to be paralyzed. Their oil industry is going to blow up. We had Trump himself go out and say, pipelines were going to explode. Nothing exploded, right? And final thing to add to all of this is that even though Iran is reliant on the Strait of Hormuz for the majority of its trade with the world, another thing to keep in mind is that Iran is not a landlocked nation. It's not an island. He has over a dozen neighbors, right? And it's a country the size of Western Europe. Good luck policing those borders. It's not going to happen. So trade is going to take place. It's just going to shift. And when it shifts, it's just going to mean there's going to be more intermediaries. There's going to be more kind of fees added to everything. And again, as a final bit, one of the countries serving as a transshipment point right now is Pakistan, which is a neighbor of Iran, which is a intermediary for the United States. They're making money off this situation where trade has to be diverted. So trade will continue. The economy will limp on. It's just going to cost more money to conduct trade. And the political leadership, are they going to fold as a result of these economic pressures? No, because these military guys, it's not their number one concern. Number two, they feel they're strong enough to deal with any kind of domestic unrest.
Yeah, a couple things. I mean, you covered a lot of territory there. Just in order of when they came up. Earlier on, you were talking about sort of these trust building measures or how the process unfolds. And if you recall, last week, Trump posted that message on Truth Social saying the Strait of Hormuz is open and, all of the men and women on these ships can thank your favorite president, Donald Trump. What I understood from Iranians, and this was a repeat of something that happened a couple of months ago where Trump posted something to that effect after Abbas Araghchi, the Iranian foreign minister, had posted that there were these moves happening toward a resumption of larger scale transit through the Strait. Trump thanked Iran. But then he turned around and he said, and by the way, we're keeping our naval blockade. And that blew up this whole trust building initial mechanism. And because of the nature of Donald Trump and his connectedness to social media, to TV, to needing the dopamine hits like immediately from calling Barack Ravid and other correspondents, the Iranians have had to kind of adjust the way that they negotiate or approach the American president. And so my understanding was that when Trump posted that, this was intended to sort of be a step in the direction of resuming the talks that could lead to an MOU, and a combination of Trump's behavior and statements, U.S. military action, striking Iran, and then the Israelis dramatically expanding their attacks on Lebanon, put the Iranians in a position where they said, well, we now need to respond. But I wanted to ask you, Mohammed, about a couple of the specifics embedded within what you're talking about. Regarding the repatriation of Iranian assets or frozen funds, there was the recent visit of Arachi, Ghalibaf, top financial officials in Iran, in Qatar, meeting not only with Qatari political leaders, but also financial leaders. There have been reports that Trump might be, or his administration might be exploring ways of repatriating or unfreezing those funds without Trump having to say he did it, because he's constantly attacking Obama over that. So that's one thing. The second thing is Trump seems really obsessed with the idea of having the Iranians make a rather broad statement about how they're not going to manufacture, possess, or import a nuclear weapon. My understanding is that the Iranians have indicated they're open to that. I think they're just talking about the sort of terminology. But it does seem as though the Israeli factor here is a real one. I think sometimes people overstate the control that Israel or Netanyahu have over American policy. And I think it lets the American empire or the American government off the hook. And you can comment on that if you choose to. But this relates to what you're saying about the domestic political and economic situation. My assessment is that there is a scenario that Israel is not all that worried about if the bombs stop falling. And that is that the Israelis have a long history of internal interference in Iran. That the assessment that the success of getting the Americans to do this heavy bombing of Iran has an impact that will make Israeli covert or influence operations inside of Iran, the terrain will be more fertile for those. That Iran is not the Iran that it was 3 months ago. Yes, everything you're saying is true about who's in political control right now. But from the Israeli perspective, they achieved something of enormous significance by getting the Americans to do this. So I'm wondering if you can pick up some of those pieces, the idea, the basic thing of how they're dealing with the repatriation of funds, perhaps Trump trying to do a backdoor thing, and then also how Israel may be fine if the bombs stop falling, because ultimately, I think they're raring to go with kind of trying to ratchet up the internal domestic instability in Iran.
So about Trump's actions and the impact they have on the negotiations, I can give you a very specific example. About a week, 10 days ago, the United States decided to attack targets on mainland Iran, and also I think there was 1 or 2 islands. And this had to do with the enforcement of the blockade. And there was a kind of exchange of fire where Iran, I think, fired a couple of drones at one of the US warships. The United States responded by attacking these kind of coastal batteries. And at the time, the United States was waiting for Iran to submit its latest response to a draft that was on the table. And based on the sources I spoke with, one of the reasons for the delay after that incident, that exchange of fire, was precisely Trump's actions. That it makes it more difficult for Iran to show flexibility when it's perceived to be under fire. And this goes both ways, obviously, right? So the US is also less likely to show flexibility when it's under fire, because nobody wants to be perceived as weak. So obviously, I think it's not just the tweets, the true social posts and all those kinds of things. There's also military actions. And here CENTCOM is an actual important player. We can go into discussion about to what extent its day-to-day operations are being led or guided by the Trump administration directly. Sometimes military guys, they can cause trouble, not just on the US side, also on the Iranian side. Many of them have pre-existing orders, they have rules of engagement, and things can go wrong quite fast. So that's one element to it. About the frozen assets. So at the very heart of what's currently being debated is money that Iran originally held in South Korean bank accounts, right? So this money had been frozen in those accounts for years. Iran was unable to access them because of US extraterritorial sanctions. And the second thing was that after a prisoner swap deal, that money was supposed to be moved into Qatar. And this happened, I believe it was in October 2024. September, October 2024. 6 weeks after that money supposedly was transferred to Qatari accounts or to Qatar, they were frozen by the Biden administration because of the protests that erupted in Iran. And also there was the pressure of Iranian support for Russia on the Russia-Ukraine war. So Donald Trump took 18 months to pull out of the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is the formal name of the 2015 Barack Obama era nuclear deal. But Joe Biden took 6 weeks to renege on his own signature on a deal with Iran for this $6 billion. Money that was held in South Korea, and it was moved to ostensibly to Qatar through Swiss bank accounts. Now we're finding out, or it seems so, that this money is actually not in Qatar itself. This money is in Qatari controlled bank accounts in third countries, which complicates the picture a lot. And then we have this added context of Trump having gone out and screeched about this kind of Obama pallets of cash, 1.6 billion to Iran, even though this is Iran's own money, the 1.6 billion. It's just bad optics. It's poor optics. How do you resolve this dilemma? Where money is in the third country, you have this context of Trump being low, and as we discussed earlier, it's about the sequencing, who goes first. Whoever goes first is going to look weak. So this sequencing of a deal is very important. If you zoom out and consider all of these factors, one of the ideas that I heard about that some may be on the table is Qatar is, in essence, extending a loan to Iran with this seized, or not seized, I would say frozen money as collateral, right? So let's say you have 6 billion sitting in a bank account, you can extend a loan of either 6 or 9 or 12 billion based on the 6 million, right? And then there's obviously going to be details such as, are you going to charge any interest on that loan being extended? Is it going to be a zero interest loan, et cetera, et cetera? Because then if, let's say, there's also the question of what happens if Trump reneges on any deal. Let's say they make a deal and we have a Biden type of situation where 6 weeks after anything is announced, Trump reneges, then what? So if the money actually being not given to Iran, but if Iran gains access to some kind of money as part of this initial understanding, if that money doesn't actually belong to Iran itself, if it's actually a loan with Iranian assets as collateral, would that be more of a reversible effort? Will that be something that harms Iran less financially? These are very complicated questions, and I think that I've discussed in detail over the past couple of weeks and months, and I think they are coming close to an understanding. And I think a setup like that would allow Trump to say, well, the United States is actually not handing over anything to Iran. Any money that's actually going to be, Iran's going to gain access to is in fact a loan, and a loan can be revoked at any moment, right? So there are many kind of details. It's got a lot to do with optics, but I think, again, more than anything, more than the substance right now, it's about the sequencing. The sequencing is what matters the most.
And the issue of of Israeli internal operations. I mean, I think it's clear that it was far more extensive than a lot of the public reaction to the events in early January indicated. And there've been recent reports in the Hebrew media, and you always have to assess, why is this being leaked? Is someone inflating it? Or that is Mossad trying to make itself look more all powerful than it may be? But it's quite clear that Israel is investing quite a bit of resources in encouraging or facilitating domestic unrest and violence inside of Iran. What about that dynamic as we move into this, potentially a different phase of this, if there is a period of months or so where the U.S. and Iran are focused on negotiating on the nuclear issue and there is some sort of an MOU?
So Israeli operations inside Iran have been ongoing for decades, taking the form, everything from political pressure through sanctions, through extrajudicial assassinations, targeted killings of nuclear scientists. We've seen the killings of political officials, even head of state. It's very rare to kill the head of state of another country, even if it's an enemy state. This is quite rare. The killing of Khamenei, I think this has not really been assessed, I think, sufficiently in mainstream media. So we also know that, based on reporting we've done and other outlets have done, that Israelis, one of their plans was to arm Kurdish opposition groups based in Iraq and to have them act as a kind of ground force. And this is why we saw initially, at the outset of the war, concentration of bombings on Iranian border posts, even police stations, even bases of the Basij militia in western Iran, to try to kind of carve out a path And turns out that the one person who apparently put a stop to that scheme was the Turkish president, Erdogan, who essentially saw the specter of Iranian Kurdish opposition forces going to Tehran as a nightmare. This doesn't look good from a Turkish perspective. They're already dealing with the issue of northern Syria, northeastern Syria, with the Kurdish statelet. You have the autonomous, semi-autonomous Kurdistan region in Iraq. And what happens if something goes wrong in Iran? That's a major national security threat to Turkey, which has the second largest army of NATO. So there is that dynamic. There is that history. It seems to me that Israel and certainly elements of the Iranian opposition are still pressing the Trump administration to agree to handing out weapons as a kind of plan B. And what I mean by handing out weapons is to arm opposition groups in Iran. Evidence points to that this has already happened on a small scale. We have not seen it on a large scale as in a mass offensive. And we've seen there's a history of this in Iran. It's not the first time that an opposition movement based abroad across the border in Iraq would be armed and then told to go inside Iran. This happened, in fact, in 1988 and towards the end of the Iran-Iraq war. At the time, Saddam Hussein, then the president of Iraq, hosted an Iranian opposition group called the MEK, the People's Mujahideen Organization, and they launched something called Operation Mersad, where their plan was to, almost identical, go into Iran, do a large single column and basically take the capital, and it was stopped. They were massacred. There were thousands of MEK members killed and stopped in its tracks. And obviously, the people who have a vivid memory of this are the people who live in that region of Iran, who happen to be Kurds. So I think many of the Kurdish groups, even if they were to be armed, even if they were to have a setup where they receive air cover from Israel or the United States, they are loath to be cannon fodder, so to speak. And I think that it's not just their own history inside Iran, which is instructing them on this. Kurds in Iraq have been betrayed, I think, by U.S. promises many times, and even in Syria, as I mentioned. Earlier this year, there was a situation where the United States sided with the Syrian central government and with Turkey in essentially defanging the Syrian Democratic Forces. So imagine SDF is allied with the United States to fight ISIS well over a decade. Overnight, they were told to put down their arms essentially and accept Syrian central government authority. That's not a really good look for the United States and for U.S. promises and credibility, etc. So I think all of this feeds into this kind of bigger assessment that there is definitely, there's a fertile climate for Israel to carry out operations inside Iran. There is broad discontent with the state of the economy, the state of governance. We clearly have massive intelligence failures inside Iran. The way Israel has been able to carry out targeted assassinations of high-ranking political and military officials is remarkable. And it's not, I think it's less that Israel is a superpower or Superman. It's more that the Iranians have been lazy, that they've been penetrated, that they've lacked discipline. And we also see that they also have not adhered to protocol. And I'll give you one very specific example. The Iranians they have known for a long period of time that things like their traffic cameras have been infiltrated, that Israel is able to hack into, for instance, Tehran's traffic camera network to keep track of movements. They even, Israelis, a hacker group affiliated with it, apparently even managed to hack the CCTV cameras inside the Evin prison in Tehran, right? So it's on that level. But the Iranians still kept the cameras on. Why did they keep the cameras on when they knew this? I think the simple reason is that they still view their own people as the number one threat. I think Iranian government right now, controlled by the IRGC, does not view Israel as the primary threat to their rule. I think they still view the potential domestic situation as a threat, although right now a threat that they can contain. So they don't see anything existential right now, I think, challenging their authority, so to speak. But I think it's details like this, looking at even now how in recent days they upgraded, apparently, like one report came out that they upgraded the traffic cameras in Tehran. And somebody joked that they're offering Mossad a HD view now into what's happening on the streets of Tehran. Why would you do this? If you wanted to do something to throw off Mossad, if you want to do something that you don't want them to see, I think the first thing that would freak out Israeli intelligence would be they're shutting down everything, shutting down and physically removing all CCTV, all traffic cameras. Then they would start to get nervous. What are they moving around on the streets? You see my point? So there are certain things that I think they're intentionally keeping them on, knowing that the other side is watching, almost maybe as a tacit signal that we're not doing what you think we're doing, right? So there's this kind of element to it. But anyway, going back to your original question, I think Israel definitely has the capacity, definitely will, to stir unrest inside Iran and to cause trouble for the Iranian authorities. But is that going to fundamentally change the political situation in Iran? I don't think so.
Mohammed, we only have a very brief moment left, but I did want to just get your brief analysis on the issue of Lebanon as it relates to the negotiations between the U.S. and Iran. I talked to some Lebanese Shia analysts who a few weeks ago were expressing concern that Iran was ultimately going to have to negotiate away from a direct linking of these fronts, and that while they might achieve some limited ceasefire as part of the MOU negotiations, that it wasn't going to ultimately be that strong of a red line. Iran did strike Israel in response to the attacks on Beirut. But I'm wondering what your sense is. At the end of the day, the Iranians, the leverage that they have, it does seem like they're going to have to spend or use that leverage to get their own concessions out of Trump. And, I know this is a big issue, but just as briefly as you can, what is your sense of what the Lebanese, particularly Hezbollah, what they can expect from the Iranians going forward, and whether or not the Iranians are going to fully go to the mat on making sure this is part of any deal?
So under Ali Khamenei, there was this kind of verbal reassurance, a commitment to Hezbollah, and then we saw that when Israel did attack Lebanon, Iran didn't take direct action. And we've seen a shift in that position from Iran, and explicitly they've gone out and said that any attack on Beirut is going to be considered attack on Iran, and we're going to attack Israel. And just an hour ago, we saw the Israeli Security Cabinet apparently pre-approving strikes on Beirut without political decision. So clearly Israel wants to pull in Iran into that dynamic where Iran has to hit Israel or kind of lose credibility. And every time it hits Israel, it gives an opportunity for Israel to hit Iran. And Israel has shown that immediately wants to hit economic infrastructure in Iran. So this is not a great dynamic for Iran, essentially. If you zoom out, what does Iran actually want in Lebanon? It wants to ensure that its allies are in power and that they have a proper share of power at the very least. And one of the interesting exchanges I had following the outbreak of the Israeli war on Hezbollah, and this is before the Israeli-US war on Iran, was a senior political insider in Tehran told me that we can't have kind of a militia that's stronger than the army forever in that country, referring to Hezbollah. It's not a natural order. And the first thing that hit me when I heard that was, well, you guys discovered this now? After almost 40 years? Surely this must be something that you kept in mind earlier. And if you zoom out even more and you look at elsewhere in the region, for instance, Iran's allies in Iraq, within the popular mobilization units, there's a big debate in Iraq right now about the integration of these militias into the state. And what does this actually mean? Does this mean dissolving these militias, Iran's allies deciding to self-implode? No, I think it's not about that. It's about they become the state. It's less militia versus the state. It's more that the militia capture of the state or becoming the state. And I think if you have the process in Iraq, where these militia groups now actually are funded by the Iraqi government to the tune of almost $3 billion a year, and they enter fully the military and become integrated units in it, then they basically control the army of Iraq. If you manage to come up with a formula in Lebanon, where there's I think something like that in Lebanon is far down the line. I'm not saying that it's on the agenda right now. But if to look at the future of how you're going to deal with integration into the national security forces of Lebanon, and if you look at the substantive issues that, okay, if the Israeli forces under any kind of deal agree to end their occupation of Lebanese territory, they decide to pull back. Keep in mind, Israel and Hezbollah have made deals in recent years. Under the Biden administration, there was a deal between Israel and Lebanon about their maritime boundary. It was demarcated. Nothing like that would be able to take place without the explicit blessing of Hezbollah. And at the time, the IRGC media in Iran was hailing that. So there's precedent, not just in the distant past, but in recent years, about Hezbollah and IRGC being able to make deals with Israel. If Israeli occupation forces leave Lebanon, if there's a deal between, for instance, Israel and Lebanon on border demarcation, and if you have a situation where Hezbollah can continue to conduct its operation, possibly down the line as an element of the armed forces of Lebanon, that's definitely something that can work out. This is kind of long-term game that Iran is looking at, because again, you have to ask yourself, what are they wanting core interest in Lebanon? Like any other country, like any other government, he wants its friends to do well. He wants its friends to be in power. Simple as that. It's not very complicated. So I think at its core, if you look at things like that, there's definitely a deal to be had. But getting to that point, especially when you're dealing with Israel, which is an actor which has zero interest in an Iran-US understanding, it gets a lot more complicated. I think I'll leave it there because there's just so much to say about that dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, we'll have you back again to talk more in depth about this. Mohammad Ali Shabani, who is the editor of a really fantastic, fairly new media organization called Amwaj.Media. Everybody should make sure to check it out. Give them your support. They're doing really hard, important work, and one of the best independent news outlets that has actual sources. Mohammad Ali Shabani, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, take care. All right, Ryan, we still have a lot to unpack here, so I'll hand it to you to bring on our next guest.
Yeah, there's been obviously the focal point of this conflict has come down to the Strait of Hormuz, Iran's ability to control it, and then the U.S. Navy's ability to kind of blockade from there. On top of it, is putting stress on both the global economy and also the Iranian domestic economy, with both sides trying to bring the other down before their opponent can't take it anymore. Lost in that are the kind of legal and political implications of what this means for the world, but also particularly for the Strait of Hormuz. There's been very little attention paid to kind of what international law actually says about this Strait of Hormuz, about the ability of a country like Oman or Iran to institute some sort of tolling regimen. And so we're going to be joined by Maryam Jamshidi, who is a international legal scholar and recently wrote a piece for The Nation magazine about kind of the intricacies of international law and also the politics that overlay it. Maryam, thank you so much for being here.
It's great to be with you. Thank you for having me.
And we're also going to be joined again by Negar Mortazavi, who is an Iranian journalist and political analyst. Negar, bring her up on the screen. Thank you too for being here.
Thanks for having me back.
You got it. And so let me put this Nation article up on the screen here, and ask you just for people who haven't read this piece yet. How do you approach something like the international law around the Strait of Hormuz if you are Iran, or if you're involved in the negotiations here? What is your broad analysis of what the actual politics and law are of this situation?
Right. So, Iran has, for decades, going back to the Shah, taken a pretty clear position when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz, that the strait is important to Iranian security interests. And the positions it's taken, for example, on the negotiation for the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is really at the heart of this debate in terms of what law applies to the Strait of Hormuz right now. The position it took when it was negotiating that treaty back in the 1970s was to push for a regime that would apply to international straits, which include the Strait of Hormuz, that would basically allow Iran to protect those security interests. So the regime that Iran abides by, that it's obligated under, is known as innocent passage. That's a regime that applied to international straits before the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea came into effect. Iran actually never ended up ratifying that convention because it believed innocent passage was the appropriate regime, and UNCLOS changed it for state parties to that treaty. It adopted a new regime called transit passage. The difference between innocent passage and transit passage is that innocent passage allows coastal states whose territorial waters fall within international straits to have more regulatory authority over those straits, in particular when it comes to their security and their safety interests. Transit passage really limits how coastal states can regulate the international straits that fall within their territorial waters. Innocent passage also allows for coastal states to charge specific fees for services that are rendered to ships. So it doesn't allow states to just charge ships for passing through straits. A toll booth isn't allowed, but states can actually charge specific fees for things like environmental services that are provided to ships, safety services, these sorts of things. So Iran, consistent with the position that it's taken for decades, and this is also reflected in domestic Iranian law that dates back to the 1990s, Iran has continued to insist that innocent passage is the regime that applies in this strait, and in particular, since the war began, has taken an even more sort of aggressive and pointed stance on this regime, as we've seen through its actions and statements about what it can and can't do in the strait, and its desire to now actually charge fees to ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz.
So I wanted to kind of put it a little more simply and get your reaction to it. To me, if you are Iran and a country wants to recognize international law, which would include then not recognizing American unilateral sanctions, like international law says that unilateral sanctions are illegal and that it's inappropriate for third countries to say, okay, well, the United States has sanctioned Iran, therefore we are also going to abide by those sanctions. So to me, from Iran's perspective, there's kind of a contradiction here. On the one hand, the international community wants Iran to follow either the law of the sea or whatever other law they've agreed to, while at the same time not following the international law when it comes to sanctions. So I would imagine that there would be a world in which the Iranians could coherently and consistently say, okay, look, for all nations that abide by international law, which means they do not abide by these illegal unilateral sanctions, we abide by the international law of the sea for ships who are transiting through. For countries that do not respect international law, fine, you don't have to respect international law, but then let's talk about getting your ships through and we can negotiate some arrangement, or if you're a hostile actor, there will be no arrangement. How is Iran combining the politics and the law here?
Right. I mean, so, there are drafts of the this new regulation that the Iranian parliament is supposedly going to vote on at some point in the near future, that, sets out a new regulatory regime for the Strait of Hormuz. And, one of the drafts I've seen suggests that one way in which Iran may start to regulate and just determine what ships get to pass through the strait has to do with whether or not they impose unilateral sanctions on Iran. So the draft that I saw suggested that basically if you participate in unilateral sanctions, if you impose unilateral sanctions, then you can't go through the strait at all. Is that permitted under international law? I mean, Iran could make an argument. There is a concept called countermeasures that basically allows a state to engage in what would otherwise be unlawful activity in order to bring other states back into compliance with international law. So, I think actually it's important to note that Iran is actually very much trying to put forward a reasonable legal argument for what it's doing. Iran sees international law as actually being very important, perhaps both from a principled standpoint, but certainly from a self-interested standpoint. Iran doesn't want to just give up on international law. Obviously, if international law worked the way it was supposed to work, Iran wouldn't have been unlawfully attacked on February 28th, right? These kinds of secondary sanctions that you were referring to, many of which are unlawful, wouldn't exist, right? So from a self-interested standpoint, international law is something that helps Iran more than it hurts Iran. And so Iran has put forward these arguments about how it's going to regulate the Strait of Hormuz, about its attacks on the Gulf states that actually seek to demonstrate that, look, what we are doing is in line with international law. And as I mentioned, because Iran is not subject to UNCLOS, it's not subject to the transit passage regime, it's subject to a different regime. And that regime does give Iran a basis to do, at least some of what it wants to do in the strait. Is it also thinking about using its sort of political and military power within the Strait of Hormuz to create a regulatory regime, again, rooted in both domestic and international law, to take some action against states that have long violated international law towards Iran? Yeah, it is. And it may be able to do that too.
I want to bring on Negar Mortazavi. Thank you for being with us again. It was really great to have you last time to offer your analysis. You were fresh off of your stint as a regular panelist on Al Jazeera. And picking up what Maryam is saying, one of the core issues that is under discussion for a potential initial memorandum of understanding is, of course, the issue of the Strait of Hormuz. The Iranians put forward what they felt were some flexible ideas, that they would delay the imposition of any kind of a fee-based system. There's also been, I think, significant reporting to suggest that they've come up with some creative alternatives to calling it a toll. And what I've heard from Iranian officials is that some of their key allies, including China, have expressed a willingness to pay a kind of environmental fee or some kind of an escort fee through the strait. Trump, just this morning and also late last night, was emphasizing that he believes that his military blockade of the strait is actually going to pay dividends in any negotiation. But given, Negar, that you're in the weeds on all of the particulars of this and picking up on what Maryam just said, where do you see the state of play right now with this MOU? It does seem like there was, and I've heard this from Iranian officials, it does seem like there was the basic contours of a memo were there, and Trump blew the whole thing up. That doesn't mean that there weren't contentious issues, that the Iranians aren't having to look at making some difficult concessions, but it does seem like the biggest problem here was Trump trying to find a way to spin victory, and he keeps thinking he's going to sort of win the surrender of the Iranians, and it's just not going to happen.
Thanks, Jeremy, Ryan, for having me back. Good to see you, Maryam. Yes, so just to give a quick answer to what you're saying, Jeremy, and I very much agree with you. It sounds like President Trump is ready to exit the war. I mean, he's been ready. I think he's been done with this war, but he wants to exit it as an absolute winner, like you're saying. He's been interested in making a deal without making concessions. And he constantly seems to be either thinking or, hearing from people here and there that if you do this one more thing, put a little more pressure, continue the blockade a little more, etc., these Iranians will surrender or will concede more. And I think as the process, the peace talks continue, and they seem to be continuing actually in parallel, to whatever's happening in the Strait of Hormuz, that the Iranians are sort of putting their foot down and highlighting some of the red lines of what they will be flexible on and what they want. And Lebanon is one of those. We can talk about it more later, but attacks on Beirut was something that they warned against earlier this week as a red line. And then when Israel did that on Sunday, the Iranians went and attacked Israel and essentially showed that they're willing to escalate on the kinetic front also to highlight that red line. On the Strait of Hormuz, I mean, adding to everything that Maryam was saying from a legal perspective, I just want to add a little more geopolitics to it. Look, Iran, as Maryam also explained, was attacked in an illegal war, unnecessary war from every angle you look at it. No vote from the U.S. Congress, no vote from the U.S. Security Council. Closest U.S. allies except Israel were all against it. The GCC countries lobbied against it heavily. Turkey, Egypt, you name it. Everyone in the region except Israel And it's created this global crisis because Iran has this newfound leverage in the Strait of Hormuz. And the Strait of Hormuz is something that had been discussed in policy circles in Iran for years, for a very long time. But this is the first time that they actually did it, this control or closing, half closing, whatever the state is right now. And I encourage the audience to look at a map. I mean, if you just look at the map, you would understand Iran's strategic geographic advantage in this very narrow waterway that is also so vital to global economy. So when people ask me why Iran is doing it, the answer is why not? I mean, if they're attacked as an underdog by two world superpowers, nuclear powers with military supremacy, the only way Iran could fight back or defend, actually, I mean, they're defending in this war, sovereignty, homeland, their independence, etc., is to fight an asymmetric war and escalate and open different fronts. One of them is Lebanon, one of them is the Strait of Hormuz. And from their viewpoint, this is actually very low cost with high return. There isn't much fighting or, dying or killing in that strait. And Iran has been able to maintain sort of this leverage since almost the beginning. And it's really put pressure not just on global economy, but also has translated here on the US economy. People see it at the pump, energy prices, and it's put pressure on Trump. So I think putting all of these together and then going back to Maryam's, to that topic that Maryam was discussing, I still see a debate inside Iran on what to do with Hormuz moving forward. There's this, as Ryan was also explaining, there's this economic thinking that, okay, we've been under an economic war, essentially illegal economic blockade by the US. This is the silent war that Iran has been under for years. And it's really devastated the Iranian economy. And is Hormuz going to be, and this peace deal also going to sort of make up for that? So Iran's thinking coming out of this war is maybe we can get something out of the battlefield with this leverage that we couldn't get at the negotiating table with this administration, which has always been economic relief in the form of sanctions relief. They also have billions of dollars of frozen assets around the world that, again, is frozen because of pressure from the US. And so that's one area they're trying to negotiate. But the counter debate to that is sort of the system, whatever the system from Hormuz is. And it's no longer a toll system, Jeremy, like you said. There's been enough opposition to that even inside Iran. Nobody's calling it a toll booth. But environmental, escort, insurance, whatever you call it, passage fee, is something that is still being discussed and debated as whether it being worth it or not, because it's something that will also annoy a lot of the neighbors, part of the global community. Not everyone is on board with it. Even the Omanis, I mean, there's discussions and conversations and negotiations, but it's not very clear if they can come up with a framework that Oman, because this waterway is shared very much between Iran and Oman. It's mostly territorial waters of these two countries, in fact, overlapping. So Oman is also a very big factor here, and how they come up with this framework. One debate I hear, or counter debate, is that the money that can be made in whatever this is called post-war may not be worth sort of annoying or frustrating or creating this global headache for Iran. But that's still a debate. And then the other issue is the wartime. I mean, they're still in war, as Maryam said. And so this is, from Iran's viewpoint, this is considered an emergency situation. And this is, a very strategic waterway just off their coast. The US has this blockade, which Iran still sees as part of the conflict, an ongoing act of war and hostile. And so whatever we're talking about as far as that framework, that legal framework, the payment, etc., is for a post-war era.
And Negar, while I have you, the New York Times and a number of other outlets then followed up with some interesting reporting over the past week. Interesting for the fact that the reporting is happening, I think, that, let me put this up, that the U.S. is raising the threat level associated with Israeli espionage. The details of some of these stories are quite intriguing. The intelligence community finding attempts by Israel to kind of bug the phones of high-level officials and so on. This, obviously, there's a several decade, or more than probably several decade level history of Israeli spying here on the United States. Meanwhile, the U.S. is legally barred from spying on Israel. But I'm curious what you make just kind of politically and geopolitically of the fact that these stories are emerging this week, and how you think it plays into these negotiations. Like, why are we hearing about this all of a sudden?
I think it's fascinating, Ryan. As you said, this is not something that's new. I mean, U.S. and Israel have spied on each other, but this is a rising threat level. And the names are interesting. I want to name the names. It's Steve Witkoff, the negotiator with Iran. It's also Eldridge Colby, the policy person at the Pentagon, and one of his deputies, Mike DeMino. These are seen as sort of the more restraint-minded officials, part of that America First camp of the Republican Party that are very skeptical of U.S. militarism, U.S. presence in the Middle East, and have been pushing for, minimizing or reducing that presence. And it's not. I don't think it's a coincidence that Israel is specifically gearing up or increasing spying on these specific officials. But it also speaks, indirectly to a fact that peace talks are going and moving forward. I think Israel's attack on Beirut just this weekend that then prompted Iran's response, despite Trump saying, trying to stop it earlier that week. And then right after Iran responded, Trump saying, I called the shots. I told Bibi to not attack Iran. And then he went and attacked Iran. And then the Iranians retaliated, all of that. I think this sort of also speaks indirectly to the fact that the peace talks are moving forward. I hear from sources on both sides that the peace talks are closer to the finish line that they've ever been throughout this war. Again, I believe it when I see it, when it's done. But there has been some progress. We know the Pakistani mediator has been very active. Other regional powers have been trying to push this to the finish line. And the Israelis, I think, are trying to sabotage that or torpedo that. Or if they can't, through this ramped up espionage, specifically in the report says they're trying to find out, it's not just U.S. military strategy, which the U.S. in fact does share with Israel a lot, but it's also Trump's strategy in the peace talks and potentially shifts in what he's going to do, because he has to make concessions to Iran, and the Israelis seem to be trying to find that. And also, the attacks on Beirut or continued attacks on Lebanon, I think speaks to the fact that, yes, they want to, again, as Netanyahu has done this in the past throughout negotiations. It happened under the JCPOA negotiations, nuclear negotiations between Iran with the Obama administration. And it's a strategy to try to torpedo or sabotage. And at the same time, if the peace deal is bound to happen, use that final window of opportunity to go in, with attacks on Lebanon as much as he can. He's done that with ceasefires also. In fact, this specific ceasefire between Tehran and Washington, as soon as it was reached weeks ago, he went in with that massive attack. Israel went in with a massive attack on Beirut, a massacre, just hours after the ceasefire. And so I think that's one of the red lines, as I said, that Iran is trying to highlight and solidify, that they want this peace deal to be regional. They want their allies to be included. They are specifically trying to fold Hezbollah into the process, because Hezbollah joined the war with Iran for the first time. It was unprecedented. They worked in coordination, collaboration. And so in war together, in peace together. And we saw that also Iran's attack on Israel this weekend was unprecedented, because for the first time they attacked Israel not in response to an attack directly on Iran, but to an attack on an ally, so in Beirut. And they sort of drew that red line on Beirut, and potentially more attacks on Lebanon. So I think that's another dynamic that's being sort of solidified in there. And of course, the end of the war from Tehran's viewpoint. All of this peace talk is about permanently ending the war so that it doesn't keep coming back to them, because the war didn't start this February. It started last June. The Iranians accepted a ceasefire, and then the war came back in the form of a regime change war by US and Israel. And so the Iranians want to fight it to a point where it permanently ends and it doesn't come back to them. And it also includes their ally.
Who they definitely don't need to be spying on is Jared Kushner, because as I understand, Jared Kushner, in both the talks prior to the February 28th bombing starting, and then also at Islamabad when the initial ceasefire was signed, that Kushner was regularly updating Netanyahu. I'm covering with our colleague Jawa Ahmad on a very intricate level the process that's playing out with Hamas and the Palestinian negotiators and this so-called Board of Peace, this epic fraudulent institution that Trump erected. And Kushner, of course, has his hands all over that. In the case of someone like Elbridge Colby, a couple of years ago, I had him on my previous podcast, Intercepted, and debated him, but also agreed with him on various things. And if you go back and listen to this, it was long. It was an hour-long conversation I had with Elbridge Colby. His position on the Middle East was a quite interesting one. So it makes sense that the Israelis would be concerned if someone like that is involved on a technical level with these negotiations. But at the end of the day, this Trump 2.0 administration has just been a carnival of sycophants. And people that I know who, including Danny Davis, who almost was nominated or put into place as Tulsi Gabbard's deputy, he said to me recently that everybody he knows inside either isn't going to say anything because they're going to get fired, and those people that do say something are then viewed with suspicion. So it's basically that you just have a kettle of hawks that are in control of this aspect of the policy. You then have people like Jared Kushner that make it so that the Israelis don't even need to really spy as long as Jared Kushner's in the room, because he's just going to be relaying everything to them. And then you have an absolute bozo like Steve Witkoff, who's been put in charge of these processes. And, we only have a few moments left, but on picking up on this, Maryam, I wanted to ask you in closing for a final comment for this stream. As you're looking at these legal issues, I'm thinking back to various points over the past decades as we transitioned out of the Cold War, the so-called Cold War period, into then the kind of new military humanism of Clinton. We're going to liberate you by bombing you with cruise missiles, and we're going to do it in the name of like women's rights or freeing people. And then you have 9/11 and the unleashing of this borderless so-called global war on terror, the kidnap and torture programs. Then you have Mr. Constitutional Law Scholar Barack Obama get elected, and he says, oh, we have to look forward, not backward. You then have Biden, the most bloodthirsty Zionist probably in American politics over the past 50 years, and he was that for 50 full years, refusing to actually end the genocide in Gaza, facilitating it for then Trump to continue it. Trump then creating this Board of Peace that will have a privatized military force mandate that the UN put its stamp of legitimacy on, unprecedented in the history of the United Nations. And we have the Iranians talking about international law, and we're talking about the Strait of Hormuz. But I'm asking you in the big picture, like, if it has never been clearer, it's clear now that this discussion of international justice, indicted war criminals are welcomed in the United States and in the capitals of several European countries. They continue to commit their war crimes even after having international arrest warrants issued for them. The United States can bomb a school in the opening hours of this war in Iran, and they can kill 165 plus people, most of them young schoolgirls. They bombed the volleyball practice also. We had a reporter that went there and did a report on this. Is it just like, is there any point anymore to talking about this? Like, I know this is your entire, life focus, but like, is there a point to talking about this anymore, given what happens in this joint Democrat-Republican project to just absolutely obliterate any serious notion of international law?
I mean, if we concede, if we say, okay, forget about it, this stuff doesn't matter, international law is not being enforced against the most powerful parties. I mean, what are we left with? We're left with a world that, in fact, these parties want. They're actively trying to make. States like the United States and Israel, they use international law when it suits them. They throw it aside when it doesn't. But increasingly, you see them just saying, you know what, forget about it. International law is irrelevant. What matters is our power. What matters is what we're able to do from an economic or military standpoint to the rest of the world. And the rest of the world has to go along with it. That might work for states like the United States and Israel because they have the authority, they have the tools, they have the leverage to basically make everyone else shut up and do what they want. But for the rest of the world, this is a horrifying situation. The deputy foreign minister of Iran a few weeks ago said, We refuse to be treated basically, and I'm paraphrasing, as second-class citizens in the international legal system. We demand to be treated equally from an international legal perspective. Part of the reason why Iran refuses to give up its right to enrichment, it's willing to enrich very little, maybe even suspend enrichment temporarily, but it's not willing to give up its right of enrichment. And the reason it's not willing to do that is because Iran is entitled under international law to enrich uranium. It is entitled under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is being weaponized against it, to enrich uranium. Now, of course, we can talk about the strategic and political reasons why Iran also wants to maintain that right. But I think Iran understands, and many other states in the global south also understand, including China, right? China, which is the closest we have to another global hegemon, also understands that international law fundamentally protects the vast majority of the globe from actors like the United States, from actors like Israel. So, my answer to questions like the one you just posed, Jeremy, is that if we were to go along with this and say international law doesn't matter, the international legal system is dead, let's stop talking about it, we give license to states like the United States and Israel to continue to do what they're doing and to spread this message of might versus right, might over right, as the way in which the international system is going to work going forward. Again, that's not a system that I think serves the vast majority of the globe. And so I think it's one we should resist. And I think it's one that we see global South states actively resisting as well.
Excellent point. And we're unfortunately we're going to have to leave it there, but want to thank both of you very much for your astute analysis. Maryam Jamshidi of the University of Colorado Law School, and Negar Mortazavi, journalist and analyst, currently at the Center for International Policy. Thank you both so much for all of your work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Ryan, that does it for this episode of our regular Tuesday live stream. Also, I think I speak on behalf of both you and myself that we continue to be really humbled at DropSite by the level of support that we receive from our readers, our viewers, our listeners. Murtaza Hussain, Sharif Abdul Qudus, and I, along with Nika Sunshang, were just in London, and we did an event at an amazing cultural space called Ibraz. And at the same time we were there was another event happening, a book event, and they do events in both English and Arabic, and it's really a remarkable space. And we also visited journalistic colleagues from Gaza who have a really great independent news organization called Palestine Deep Dive. Sharif and I did an hour and a half interview with them that they're gonna post tomorrow. But at these in-person events, in London, the one we did at Ibraz, so many people came up to us. We met people from Iran, from Pakistan, from Palestine, from Gaza in Palestine, from all around the world that came to those events. And just hearing what the journalism at DropSite means to them, what our reporters, our incredibly brave reporters on the ground inside of Gaza, in the occupied West Bank, reporting from Lebanon, from Syria, from Iran, it's why we do it. And, we publish long, in-depth articles. We know that we live in a TikTok, Instagram, Twitter era. But I think all of us feel proud of the fact that we're powered primarily by the people who are watching this or who are reading our articles, and we're beholden to you. We're beholden to the people that keep the lights on at DropSite News and that pay those journalists who risk their lives to do this reporting. So, on behalf of both of us, I just want to thank everybody who supports us. And some of it's financial, some of it is just spreading the word. If you can afford to become a voluntary paid subscriber, that's the best way that we get predictable income, that we can make decisions on what we expand in terms of our coverage, et cetera. That would be the chief way, but nothing's ever going to be behind a paywall. That was a commitment we made from the very beginning.
No, I second that. Huge thank you to everybody. And whenever I meet somebody who reads us, I don't know what your interactions are like. I always ask them, do you read the morning newsletter, and is it too long? And sometimes we're like, a little bit long, but in general, people I think they like that it's there when they do have time for it. and it is the only place that you're going to get that level of depth and breadth of information that you can actually trust is accurate. But yeah, those are the focus groups that I always tend to do.
Well, and I mean, we should say, behind the scenes too, our colleague Nausicaa Renner, who was with us from the beginning in creating DropSite, you don't often see her like on our streams. She's not a big social media creature, but every day she does the hard work, behind the scenes, and it's the daily grind and really keeps everything flowing. Our colleague Roger Hodge, also a really phenomenal world-class editor. Jawa Ahmed, Sharif Abdel Qaddus, Justin Wutterkin, all of the people that work on that daily newsletter. It's a labor of love and of passion, and and you make it possible. So, on behalf of everybody at the DropSite News team, I want to encourage you to become a paid subscriber if you can. If not, you can let your friends, your family, even your foes know about us. On behalf of the whole team, deep gratitude to you all. Until next time, I'm Jeremy Scahill with Ryan Grim. We'll see you at dropsitenews.com.